Hey, Beth, what's going on? Cool. Can I try?
Sure. Well, Morse code is an alphabet code. It's a series of dots and dashes, and you write them down and they make letters, and then you decipher the letters and you get a message. Oh.
That sounds complicated, so why are you listening to it?
In the early days of navigation, you needed to know this so that you could navigate around the world. There weren't cell phones or radios or radar the way we have today, so people would have to learn Morse code so that they could navigate.
But to navigate, if you get close to an airport, you just see the airport and you land.
If there's an airport. In the early days of navigation, there weren't any airports, there weren't any runways, there weren't even any flight paths the way we know them today. Charles Lindbergh had to study the Great Circle route so that he could figure out how to fly from New York to Paris to make that historic flight.
What's the Great Circle route?
That's a little more complicated. Do you have some time?
I've got about 30 minutes.
Hi, I'm Beth.
And I'm Marty.
Last month on STEM in 30, we celebrated the 112th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight.
Today, we hop on an airplane, we fly 3 hours, and we get to Grandma's house. It's not a big deal. It's a really big deal. There are air routes that have to be considered and a lot of advancements in aviation in only 112 years.
And Charles and Ann Lindbergh really helped promote something called air-mindedness. It really got people thinking differently about how we could use airplanes in our everyday lives. We'd like to first start by welcoming our online audience, and we want to remind you to submit questions. We may be able to use them on the show. If not, we do have an expert standing by. Marty, this is usually the part where I say, Marty, why don't you introduce our in-house audience?
Well, we don't have an in-house audience today, and there's one word that describes that, and that's snow. Over the weekend, Washington, D.C. was slammed with a blizzard. We got between 20 and 30 inches of snow. We affectionately called the blizzard Snowzilla. But the show must go on, so we really need your online questions today. But today, we are coming to you live from the Barron Hilton Pioneers of Flight Gallery. Now, this gallery is filled with all kinds of artifacts from the early days of aviation. As a matter of fact, we have the Douglas World Cruiser here. This was the first plane to fly all the way around the world. There were 4 of them, all named after different cities. The one we have on display is called the Chicago. Now, my personal favorite artifact that we have here in the gallery is this Lockheed Vega. It was owned by Amelia Earhart, and she used it to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this thing was built for speed. It has wheel pants on it. Those are coverings over the wheels. It also has a single wing design and no wing struts. There's a cowling over the engine that covers it. All of those things reduce drag, which makes this a really fast airplane. Another airplane we're going to be talking about today is this funny looking one back behind me called the Tinghamasartog. We're going to get to that here in a little bit, but first, Beth is with our very first guest today.
I'm joined by Dr. Peter Jacob. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Now, the Spirit of St. Louis actually hangs in the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall, which is undergoing a facelift right now, and it's slated to be open later this year?
Opens in July of 2016, which is the 100th anniversary of the Boeing company and the 40th anniversary of this museum building.
That's very exciting. So we hope you all can join us here in July. We are talking about the Spirit of St. Louis. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how Charles Lindbergh got his start in aviation?
Well, Lindbergh, like many young people in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, was fascinated by aviation. It was the most exciting new activity that any young person could engage in at that time, I guess. And he became an airmail pilot, which in the early 1920s was really the most dangerous and difficult type of flying, because the airmail had to get through no matter what the weather was, because the key thing was to establish aviation as a safe and reliable and important commercial entity in the United States at that time. And airmail was one of those things that was going to establish that. So Lindbergh became an airmail pilot, and he was really quite a good one.
And looking at the Spirit of St. Louis, I noticed that it doesn't have a front windshield. Wouldn't you need a windshield if you're flying long distances?
Well, it's a long way from the United States to Europe, and Lindbergh estimated that he was going to have to be in the air upwards of 40 hours. The actual flight time was about 33 and a half hours. So we needed an engine that was incredibly reliable, but also a lot of gasoline. And one of the places to put a lot of gasoline was a large fuel tank between the pilot and the engine. And Lindbergh figured, well, in 1927, there really isn't going to be an awful lot of airline traffic across the Atlantic Ocean, so forward visibility wasn't all that important. He was able to look out the sides of the airplane through the windows, and he also had this imaginative little device inside the cockpit. It was a periscope that he could slide out and look forward if he needed to, but mostly he just looked out the side.
Now, why is this flight from New York to Paris at this time so important?
The Lindbergh flight really was sort of a milestone in terms of establishing aviation as a viable, safe, commercial entity, particularly in the United States. Prior to the Lindbergh flight, there were some important building blocks that were put in place in terms of airline safety and regulation, but Lindbergh's singular personal achievement really kind of put the stamp on that and really put a face on aviation. And in fact, it became known in the period after that, where there was great investment and building of aviation, as the Lindbergh boom, as a result of Lindbergh's very, very important flight, which was really a catalyst for that.
Now, this plane has undergone some restoration, I understand, and a lot of it was done on the cowling. So we actually have a video of Malcolm Cullum and Bob van der Linden talking a little bit about how you restore a treasure like the Spirit of St. Louis.
Whenever we start with any sort of project, before we lay hands on an artifact, we try to do as much historical research as possible to really anticipate things or look for particular historical clues about an artifact once we start working on it. So whenever we started the cleaning, we made sure that we weren't going to be stripping off any original materials or colorants off the flags. So we started going through, and at first we were sort of shocked. Because it was such a dramatic transformation. You really were starting to see the engine turn decoration was coming out, and we contacted Bob right away and let him know that we're getting quite a strong before and after result here, but we've confirmed by comparing our UV photography from before the cleaning and during the cleaning that basically all the original materials were just taking off dirt and grime. So what you see now is a much more vivid interpretation of what the original markings would have looked like back in the time period. You can still see some of the light yellowing that's from the original coating there, but now that all the dirt and the grime has been removed, the colors are more vibrant in the flags. The engine turning, I said, is much more vibrant.
What'd you use to clean it? I love this.
We use just water. Water on cotton swabs and slow and gentle cleaning. So it was a very tedious process, but because we're dealing with original surfaces, the last thing you want to do is any sort of mechanical cleaning or any sort of polish compounds at all, no strong chemicals whatsoever. The fact that we got such a dramatic cleaning with just straight up water was really quite a thrill to all of us.
Peter, are you ready to take some questions?
Sure.
We have a video question first.
My name is Kaylee Shackelford, and my question is, what did Lindbergh do when he had to go to the bathroom?
What did Lindbergh do when he had to go to the bathroom in this 40-hour flight?
Well, actually, although Lindbergh wrote a great deal about the flight, that particular personal matter he didn't really specifically write about. But if you can imagine being on a long car ride without being able to stop, you get kind of resourceful. And I imagine that Lindbergh was just as resourceful as you would be if you were stuck in that situation.
So it's not like, astronauts where we know everything.
There was no special equipment provided Lindbergh. As I say, you can imagine what types of resources he might have used to deal with that situation.
Let's take an online question. Why was the plane called the Spirit of St. Louis? How did it get its name?
The actual formal name of the airplane is the Ryan NYP monoplane. Ryan was the manufacturing company in San Diego, California, and NYP stood for New York to Paris, so it was called the NYP. Okay. But Lindbergh, although he did put in some money of his own to purchase the airplane, he had some investors from the city of St. Louis. And as they were developing some ideas about the airplane, they came up with the name, the Spirit of St. Louis. So the actual name of the airplane is the Ryan NYP Spirit of St. Louis.
Now, Lindbergh didn't take off from New York and follow a known air route. So how did he get from New York to Paris?
Well, as we discussed earlier, he was a very experienced airmail pilot, so he was used to flying long distances across the United States. But flying across the ocean, you don't have a lot of landmarks to look out for. So he actually flew using a technique called flying the Great Circle route. And these were routes along the globe, along the lines of latitude on the globe, and he would mark out certain segments of the flight along this great circle that was joining the northeastern United States and Europe, and he would chart his way, literally just charting his way across the Atlantic.
Now, it's a little hard to explain that. So we have an animation, I hope, that will visually help our online viewers to see what the Great Circle route looks like.
Humans like to travel efficiently. Less time, less distance, and less fuel are all goals of efficient travel. Normally, we think of the shortest distance between 2 points as a straight line. So why does Lindbergh's flight have a big curve in it? On a sphere, the shortest distance between 2 points falls along a great circle. If you were to slice a globe through its center, a great circle would form its circumference, just like the equator. When Charles Lindbergh made his historic flight from New York to Paris, he followed a great circle route. When this route is unfolded on a flat map, it appears as a curved line. This is also why airline flight paths appear on maps as curved lines. They follow the curvature of the Earth along a great circle route.
We're now joined by Dorothy Cochran, a curator here at the National Air and Space Museum. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now, the plane that we're standing in front of looks a lot different than the Spirit of St. Louis. Why is that?
Well, it was built just a couple of years later, but it's based on your favorite airplane, the Lockheed Vega. And Charles had it modified for the purpose of these overseas, overwater flights and exploratory flights, and put the mechanical instruments and equipment that he needed for that flight in it.
Awesome. Now, the plane that we see here was used on that Great Circle route on the trip north to the Orient. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip?
Yeah, that was a 1931 flight, and Pan American was the international airlines establishing routes, getting ready to go further and farther across oceans. So they needed to know where they could fly and where they might be able to establish airports. So that was what Charles was charged with. And so he went with his co-pilot, who happened to be his wife, Morrow Lindbergh.
Now, she was much more than just a passenger on this plane. She played a really big role in this flight.
Absolutely. Charles taught Anne to fly. In fact, their first date was her first flight lesson. And she got her license in 1931, and then she went with him as the co-pilot, so when he needed to sleep, she could actually fly the airplane. But more importantly, she was the radio operator, the sole radio operator. And as we saw earlier, that had to do with Morse code. So she had to learn Morse code and become very efficient at receiving and sending messages so that she could determine, they know what the weather would be, where they were headed, and approximately when they could tell people when they might get there, when to look for them, what the conditions were. It was all very important, and that was a helpful form of navigation for people to find out where the Lindberghs are now.
And all of that equipment was in this plane while they were flying?
It was all in the back seat where she flew. She was behind Charles. She had her equipment so that she could do the Morse code with her left hand, and then she could do other things with her right. And she has her receiver, the transmitter, and of course the all-important telegraph key. She became so good at it that she established a long-distance record and received awards following the flight.
I don't think I'm coordinated enough to be able to do that.
She called it like using a four-handed piano.
Wow. Wow. Now, recently, Reeve Lindbergh, the daughter of Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, came to the museum here in Washington, D.C., and Beth had a chance to talk with her about her famous family.
Today we are talking to Reeve Lindbergh. Ms. Lindbergh, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Now, your parents were truly pioneers in aviation. Your father flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic, and your mother was a radio operator for a flight at a time where you had to know Morse code to know where you were going. So when you reflect on your family's history with aviation, what's one of your favorite stories to tell?
Well, I have a lot of stories, and one of my favorites has to do with my mother talking about, actually she wrote about this as well, she talked about when they were flying, as she called it, north to the Orient, up over the pole to Asia. They were charting the earliest air routes for the airlines, and they must have been something like 26 and 29 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. She found that she was standing with my father about to take off, and he was asked all these very kind of heavy, masculine, technological questions about the fuel and how far they were going and all kinds of things about the airplane, about the flight. And she was asked, how do you do your housekeeping in this aircraft? And so she was an early aviator. He said she was as good a pilot as he was, maybe better. And she would say, oh, Charles. But she also was a radio operator and a navigator, and very much part of that whole process, very much a partner, as she always was.
And she wrote about this journey in her book, North to the Orient and Listen in the Wind.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that trek. Now, they were working to chart airline routes, is that correct?
That's correct, because there were no charted airline routes. And one of my father's jobs after his flight to Paris, nonstop solo flight to Paris, was to promote aviation and to help aviation develop. And he was asked to fly over the pole to Asia. I believe they called it the Great Circle Route.
Okay.
And my mother went with him as his co-pilot and navigator and partner, and very young. They were both very young, and they went to places where the people had never seen an airplane before, and figured out the best routes for the airlines to follow.
Now, Dorothy, something that I notice on this airplane behind us, it has no wheels. Why not?
It doesn't have wheels because where they were flying, there were no airports. They are exploring. They're up in areas that do not have airports. They don't even have solid ground. So they are always looking for a place to land, and there's a lot of water, and they knew there would be. So they can, if they put the pontoons on the plane, they can land on rivers, oceans, lakes, and they're safe.
Really opened a lot more possibilities for them.
Exactly.
Now, some of the science behind the pontoons that they used involves surface tension. So we have a little experiment here. This is a real easy one to do in your classroom or at home. We have a paper clip, and if we're real gentle and put it into the water, nice and level, it'll float. So we've got this paper clip floating on the water, and that's the same principle that happens when you fill up a glass of soda and it gets all the way to the top and almost goes over, but it doesn't. Surface tension is holding that there. Well, the same thing happens with this paper clip. Surface tension is holding it on the top of the water. Now, with a plane like the Tingmissartoq that has pontoons, the weird thing is it can't take off on still water. So unless there's a ripple in the water, this plane is stuck on the water.
Right.
So you have to have a little bit of a ripple. So here in a second, I'm going to add a ripple to this water, and we're going to see what happens to the paper clip. So if I take my finger and I just add a ripple, that paper clip sinks. And that same thing has to happen for this plane to be able to take off. There has to be a ripple in that water to break that surface tension to allow that plane to actually get into the air. So there's kind of the science behind a pontoon plane. Now, Dorothy, are you ready to take some questions?
Absolutely.
All right, let's go to our first video question.
My name is Shane Nicholas, and I would like to know what Lindbergh ate during the journey if he got hungry.
They took with them a whole array of canned foods. So they had baked beans, they had Pan American flight supplies, emergency food, dried food, a whole array of canned and preserved items with them. And then when they got to a location, they could be eating fresh salmon.
That sounds really good. All right, let's go to an online question. What was more dangerous, the flight across the Atlantic or north to the Orient?
Well, I don't know that either was more dangerous. The flight across the Atlantic and into Europe was much longer, so it took a lot more time and a lot more effort. They went 30,000 miles, so the first flight was only 10,000. So just in terms of sheer mileage and duration, that was probably the more dangerous. Although going to the Arctic was still pretty unknown.
Wow. Now, the Lindberghs were both very accomplished authors as well as pilots and radio operators. And I recently had an opportunity to talk with Reeve about one of her children's books, Nobody Owns the Sky. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the book, Nobody Owns the Sky. This is the story of Bessie Coleman. Can you tell me a little bit about her story?
Bessie Coleman is one of my great heroes, and she was the first licensed African-American aviator in the world. And she was brought up picking cotton, and she looked up and she said to herself, I really want to fly, and if I want to fly, I have to get out of these cotton fields and above the clouds. And by golly, she did it. She was raised at a time when if you were black or if you were a woman, there was no chance to get a pilot's license in the US. And so she eventually went to France and got her license there and came back and taught as much as she could. She lectured and taught and told people through her own aerial adventures that anybody could fly. And I was so struck by this because she had so little publicity. My parents were overwhelmed with publicity for their aerial adventures, and it was oppressive and difficult for them to have quite so much fame, which sounds funny, but it was true. Bessie had none, very, very little at that time. And I was so impressed with her for persisting. She was beautiful as well, which is also a wonderful thing to recall and look at in the old pictures. And I started to write this little poem just about her bravery and really her sense that in the sky there was freedom.
Now, you dedicate the book to her family. Do you feel a connection with her family?
I do feel a connection with her family. I spoke on the phone to her niece, Marion Coleman, who was a wonderful woman, and tried to contact anybody I could who had connections with the early African-American pilots, and have become friends with a fellow named Philip Hart, who has an early pilot ancestor and knew the community of the first black aviators. So I did quite a bit of research, but I really wanted this book to be for kids, and I wanted it to have a kind of poetry and cadence that would make kids want to read. Most of my books for children, all of them in fact, are in rhyme because it's for reading, and kids often will learn to read if they have a rhyme.
Wow. And one of the lines that I love out of the book is, the air has no barrier, boundary, or wall. What lessons can kids learn from the struggles that Bessie Coleman went through?
I think they can learn that you can succeed. Not so easy for a lot of kids. I mean, this is an easy thing to say, but she had as many barriers as anybody possibly could, and was able to prevail through the support of her friends, through her own determination, through her mother, who by golly was going to have her children learn to read even though she didn't. And Bessie overcame it all.
Now, we've been talking about the Lindberghs as writers, and so we've decided to highlight some books. And Dorothy, I'm going to start with North to the Orient by Morrow Lindbergh. Can you guys tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's really an extraordinary piece of aviation literature, one of the best. We highly recommend it. And it's interesting because she wrote it, she took notes while she was flying, while she was already doing the radio work, and it just comes out so well, so detailed, and it's a beautiful view of flying in the golden age of flight, so much closer to the ground, feeling the seat of the pants flying. Really terrific book.
And this one is a memoir by her daughter, Reeve.
Yeah, Reeve wanted to write about her parents from her point of view as a child, growing up with them, flying with her father, watching both of her parents write, and just a great snapshot of that family from the inside.
Now, Marty, you picked this one.
Yeah, this is by our curator, Bob Vanderlinden, and it's Charles Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis. And the thing that I really like about this book is it's got some great historic images from the collection here at the National Air and Space Museum and pictures of their flight. Just really a great look at Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis.
Now, the last one is one I want to talk about. This is not about the Lindberghs or by the Lindberghs, but it does talk about the Chicago, which is in this gallery, and it's written by an educator here, Tim Grove. He worked on this exhibition and became so inspired by the story that he felt he needed to write a book. And again, this has got a lot of wonderful artifacts in it from the museum and our archive collection, and it's really a great story as well. So the Lindberghs, their role in promoting aviation through writing and actual doing is something very unique. Can you tell us a little bit about how you feel that they really promoted aviation during this time?
Well, they flew these extraordinary flights, and the whole legacy of that is that these are the air routes that we still use today. This is what aviation flying, this is what commercial aviation is based on. And they did this together as a couple in the 1930s. So it's just their legacy is tremendous.
Let's go to a video question. You guys ready for questions?
Sure.
Let's try a video question.
My name's Caitlin Francis, and my question is, how much did Lindbergh's trip cost, and where did all his money come from?
Peter, how much did it cost to fly the Spirit of St. Louis and buy the plane? And where did that money come from?
Well, the airplane cost $15,000, and Lindbergh had $2,000 of his own money to put up, which was quite a sum of money considering he was a poor airmail pilot at the time. And he had a number of financial backers from the city of St. Louis, and they put up the rest of the money to purchase the airplane. And one of the problems Lindbergh had was in trying to purchase the airplane, some of the manufacturers wanted to choose the pilot. But he intended to be the pilot. And he did find a small company in San Diego, California, called Ryan Airlines, and they fabricated the airplane for him, working with him closely on the specifics. And that's how it became the Spirit of St. Louis.
And we have an online question. How long after Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic did it become routine to make that trip? Peter?
Well, I would say it's not routine yet, because we still have delays and other kinds of things that can happen. You know, flying is a complicated activity, but seriously, it was probably until the late 1930s where you started to have commercial transport across the United States reliably, and then really after the Second World War into the 1950s where you had these long-distance transoceanic flights where the average person or the relatively average person could make these long-distance flights.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us today. We're running out of time, but I want to mention next month we will be taking a look at the Tuskegee Airmen, and so check this out. Hi, I'm Beth Wilson, and I'm in the Rare Books Library at the National Air and Space Museum. Reeve Lindbergh, the daughter of Anne and Charles Lindbergh, was a writer just like her parents.
Weren't her parents pilots?
Her parents were pilots, but they were also writers. And Reeve has written a really terrific book called Nobody Owns the Sky about African-American aviator Bessie Coleman.
There was a young woman who wanted to fly, but the people said, "Kiss that wish goodbye. The sky's too big and the sky's too high, and you never will fly, so you better not try." But this woman laughed and she just said, "Why? Nobody owns the sky."
If you want to learn more about African American aviators, be sure to check out STEM in 30. So we want to be sure to thank the Gertrude E. Skelly Foundation, who funded today's program. And again, I want to thank Peter and Dorothy for talking to us about the Lindberghs. We hope to see you next month.